أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful. And may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajal farajahum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And thank you for joining us once again in our series, Life, the Islamic Answer. We were discussing the topic of community of knowledge in Islam, and we had gone down the list of who belongs to the community of knowledge. We discussed the learner, the teacher, the child, or the young, the youth. We discussed the role of woman and the relationship between woman and knowledge, the family in a community of knowledge. And we started talking about a topic that is usually not addressed commonly in our communities, and that is the role of the intellectual in the community of knowledge. And we defined the intellectual as being someone who has an interest in participating in the work of the community, initially at some sort of intellectual level, without having any expertise or being an expert formally in religious sciences in Islam. We want to understand what is the role of this person, given the fact that, and that's why we think that this is a relevant topic for us. First, the majority of us would fall in this category. The majority of those who belong to a community or who want to belong to a community of knowledge, we are not the experts in religion. We're not experts in Islamic sciences. We may have one or multiple other areas of expertise, but not Islamic sciences. And so this topic becomes very relevant to us directly, first. Secondly, we want to understand whether it is us or others in the community who fall in this category. What does the role look like? Is it a role of leadership? And is it proactive? Do I have to wait for someone to invite me and ask me, or do I have to take the initiative? The moment that I find myself in this category, I should know what my religious duty is. Or is it even a passive role? So it could be an active role. It could be a reactive role. Someone asks me and I react to their request. It could be proactive. No one asks me and I take the initiative. Or it could be completely passive and I don't participate. I am an innocent bystander who watches and observes and maybe participates by attending, for instance, but not more, not an active role. We want to understand, and we're not claiming, by the way, that we're going to answer these questions. We want to feed this discussion and give food for thought so that within our communities, when we think about this, first we do think about it. We have the awareness, the consciousness, the maturity as a community to think about these topics and to structure ourselves appropriately and equip ourselves accordingly. And so the next point of relevance is that this is going to have an impact on the structure of our communities. If we think that the only formal official role belongs to the person who has religious expertise, then that means that everything begins and stops with that person and whatever they see fit. And so they may assign tasks and duties to people, and that could be it. Or we say, no, the intellectual also has an active role to play. So we want to understand, what does that mean, and what is the relationship, or what type of community structure do we end up with once we recognize that this role exists and is important and recognized in our communities. And as we said, even though we may not find that this is a question that is directly addressed, this is a lived experience for our communities. We know that there is a pressing need to address this question and resolve it and take position and build on the consequences or the conclusions of our reflection on this point. And so this was why we're talking about all of this. Therefore, we started the discussion by saying that when we look at this question at a high level, we see that this is a question that exists in the world. Even though maybe in our communities we're not addressing the question, this is a question that many thinkers have been thinking about, reflecting about, and this question exists in the West. Let's call it the West, even though that's not an accurate description. Inshallah, in the future we can talk about that. What does that mean, the West? But generally speaking, I think we all understand what we mean. By the non-Islamic Western world, this is a question that they have been thinking about for a few centuries now. And there are books dedicated to this, and thinkers who have spent a lot of time on this question. What is the role of the intellectual in society? What should they do? What are they actually doing? And what else should they be doing or not doing? And then we see that if we want to follow the chronology, we want to follow a timeline, we notice that in the Islamic world, the question exists as well. And in fact, as I have claimed, there is not a single serious Islamic thinker in the Islamic world who has not addressed this question. And some of them have made it one of their major projects, and some of them have touched on it on the side. All major Islamic thinkers from all schools of thought. In fact, it goes beyond just Islamic. Even those who are non-Muslims, especially in the Arab world, because this question is so present. For instance, there are Christian thinkers, there are Marxist, communist thinkers, and secular thinkers who have also addressed this question. And they have also taken position with regards to the intellectual in Islamic society, even though they may themselves not be Muslims, or the intellectual in the Arab society, for instance. And so all this to say, it's not irrelevant for us to talk about this question, because this is a question that in the West exists at a very mature, very serious level. It exists. In our Islamic world, it exists very much. But the truth is, it exists in the world of the elites. It exists in the academic world. It exists in the world of the intellectuals themselves who are wondering about it, and the specialists and the experts. The commoners may not be fully aware. But this is what we're doing in this series too, is that we're trying to raise the awareness and the maturity level and how we think about ourselves and our communities. And so if this question exists, we can't just ignore all of this scholarship and all of this thinking about the question and jump into it, right? And so we started by looking at what we called the macro level. Why is it that the West started to think about this question? Why is it that the West seems to be interested in a question that then later the Islamic world became very interested in as well? And this we are calling the macro level, macro social, economic, political, and cultural level discussion that has direct impacts on day-to-day life. And this is the result of a series of events that took place, major events, milestones, transformations that took place in the West. And then in some cases, they have parallels in the Islamic world. Sometimes it's the exact same event, but the way it has repercussions in the Islamic world is going to be different. And then in the Islamic world, there are also events that were specific to the Islamic world that don't have anything that mirrors them in the Western world. That also exists. And so in the last two lectures, this is what we addressed. In the first lecture, we focused on the Western world and the major milestones. And in the last lecture, we focused on also introducing the milestones that took place in the Islamic world. What I wanted to do today, inshallah, is go over the events without providing the details that we provided. Now I'm going to put them one after the other, presenting both at the same time, with a reminder of what is happening at the level of thinking around the intellectual in the Islamic world and in the Western world, so that we understand a little bit more clearly, because we looked at each separately. We want to understand a little bit more clearly how perhaps some of the thinking in one of these two worlds is affecting the thinking in the other. What is happening in the West is affecting live, and what are the repercussions? What are the intellectual or argumentative repercussions of that thinking and those events? And then we will move, inshallah, today to the newer topic, which is to try to start giving the major themes, especially in the Western world, that emerged from this. And I don't want to, this discussion could be very, very detailed, and I want to keep it focused on a couple of themes because they're going to be relevant to us a little bit later for our communities and what it means and how we think about this topic of the intellectual. And we will see that they're going to re-emerge in a very different way. The same themes are going to re-emerge in Islamic thinking. But you'll see that the concerns are coming from a different place, inshallah. So keep that in mind and we'll come back to it, inshallah. So the events that we went through very quickly. We said the triggering event for this way of thinking about different roles in society is the enlightenment or the rise of rationalism. So we are talking about the mid-1600s and upwards. That's when the enlightenment happens. To summarize it all once again, this is when the Western world lets go of what was called the tradition or the traditional world that was based on religion and revelation and God, and replaced all of that with science. So science became the new religion, and the tool instead of revelation is now reason. So reason, science, and the individual or the human being. And this is where, you know, when Nietzsche says, his famous words, God is dead, this is what he means. Right? So there's no more God in the structure. There's a human being only. Right? So we'll talk about that in detail at another time. But this is what happens, and this is a triggering event. This is a major milestone. The world was going in a certain direction, and now you transform the entire way, the entire worldview, the entire way you understand your place in the world. What is the world? What am I? And where is my place in the world? And what are the relationships between everything? If there's no more revelation, there's no more religion, there's no more God or church and state represented by the monarch, by the king and queen, it's replaced by all of this. What does this all mean? And this is where suddenly the meaning of intellectual changes overnight. Intellectual used to mean the person who works in the court of the king, that the king hires. For instance, the philosopher who's writing the plays, who's writing the poetry, who entertaining the elites, and so on and so forth, or the clergy. Usually those were the people who were educated, who spent their lives studying. They had the luxury of studying, having books, knowing how to read, so on and so forth. Now there's a major shift, and all of that is out the window, and the role or the meaning of the intellectual changes. It's no longer the clergy. Now it's the man of science, the man who knows how to use the reason, philosopher in a different sense. And inshallah, later in the series, maybe we talk about this, I don't know, or other series or other opportunities. I'm thinking in parallel, inshallah, maybe to have a series just to go through the history of philosophy in detail and explain because a lot of these words and these notions and these schools of thought are very meaningful. And the better we understand them, the better we understand our world today. And, you know, it takes 3 minutes of listening to someone talk and you can quickly qualify them and assess them and say they belong to that school of thought. These are their arguments. This is where they're coming from. And this is my reaction to that and my position to that. In any case. So this happens. We said we're not going to give the details. Today was just supposed to be the reminder and the linkages. And so at this level, at this milestone is a trigger of a domino effect that is who is now the intellectual as opposed to who was it before, one. And two, the intellectual himself is now going to play the role of the critic of the traditional world. They are justifying why this new world and this new world view is the correct one. And why the traditional world is the one that we had to let go if we want to achieve a higher level of maturity and progress, and society is moving forward, not backwards. This is where what it meant to become an intellectual at that time. And mainly, it meant you are a defender of the new world order at that time. And this is where you see, as we said, you see a lot of the philosophes, as they called them. In this way, I say it because they were the French philosophers. This was the French Revolution is part of all of this. I don't want to break it down into the different revolutions that happened and how they were different from each other. But the French philosophers were major figures in all of this. So they played a big role. Even though there are differences between them, they played a very major role, and they became one of the strongest archetypes of who is the intellectual. If you want to be an intellectual, you look at them and you follow in their footsteps and you understand what they're doing. This is the Voltaire and the Rousseau and the Montesquieu and Diderot and others. Okay? And in there, even though he comes much later, perhaps almost 200 years later, you have like Kant, a figure like Kant, who completely, pushes philosophy forward with his thinking and so on and so forth. Very pivotal figure in philosophy. But he belongs to that tradition, even though there's a lot more to say because Kant was a very religious man. But he kept religion away from his philosophical thinking and what he presented to the world. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later today when I said I think we need to understand a few of the big names and a few of the big ideas around what it means to be an intellectual in the West. Okay, the big themes that came out, and we'll mention that quickly. So that happens. Now we move to about 100 years later. We have the Industrial Revolution. And this is going to cause, mainly, we're not focused on the economic aspect of it. We're not focused too much on the political aspect of it. We're focused on the social change that emerges from this. The more these countries become industrialized and they can now rely on heavy machinery to do work, the more it starts to become clear that there are different social classes. And there are people who can live well, and there are people who are being used and abused by this system. And so now the intellectual is going to be the one who starts to notice this and start to analyze it. Why is it that this is the case? Why is it that some seem to have all the resources and all the capital and others don't? And how come those who do not take themselves out of their situation and improve their state? What is preventing them? And so this is where all of this starts to happen, and we start to see hints that became much more real later, much more concrete later. Here we start to see hints that the intellectual is also the one who notices and fights against social injustice. And this is the work of Marx. He is the biggest figure in this time. His whole theory and his whole thinking is what? What is he trying to do? Marx is an economist. Why is he concerned with, creating a completely different way of understanding the world and understanding society and how human beings should live? Because his main preoccupation is that there is social injustice in the world. There are people who are living a very poor life. And their poverty is not just at the material level, but they are so poor materialistically speaking or materially speaking. They have so many concerns and worries about not having enough food and not having shelter and living a life of those who are deprived, that they can never be fully fulfilled as human beings, because you never get to the point where you have the luxury and the comfort and the safety and the security to now start thinking about higher level thinking. Okay, and all of that is present in Marx's thinking. And so this became extremely powerful in a world, especially for people who do not have. People who are living in this misery and this poverty, and here is someone who explains it all to you. And not everyone has the tools to see he is right here and he is wrong here, and he is strong here in his thinking and he is weak here. And he says, I therefore predict that in industrial societies there will be major revolutions, starting with the UK. But the first revolution happened, and that was the next milestone in Russia. It didn't happen in the UK. So there's clearly some huge mistakes in his thinking, but still, he predicted a revolution, and a revolution did happen. Okay, and so on and so forth. So here we start to see, and if we want to take the thinking about the intellectual a little bit further, We have to even start, I don't want to do this because this would take a much longer time to cover, but to show that when we talk about the intellectual, we might think of a certain class of people who are engaged in this activity. It's a lot wider. Like for instance, it's anyone who is engaged in any type of intellectual activity in society. This is what we should look at. So this is why, for instance, I mention here people like Charles Dickens. He's writing novels. Until today, people are reading his novels. And a lot of people not only enjoy the literary aspect of what he's writing because he's a really good storyteller, there's something universal. He is highlighting social injustice. He's bringing to life people who don't have much in life. So he's trying to focus on the beauty of their humanity because they have nothing else. They're poor. They're deprived. They're the lowest of the low. And he's writing about them. And then this is his way of fighting the injustices and the oppression of his world. So this is where you can take this discussion very far if you want to think about who is the intellectual and what do they do and the role that they play in society. That's why I mentioned these people who are perhaps a little bit outside the very strict way of thinking. They're philosophers, they're thinkers, systematic thinkers, sociologists, economists, philosophers. It goes beyond all of that, right? It includes art, it includes literature, and so on and so forth. In the meantime, as this is happening in the West, you have the decline of the Ottoman Empire. This is when it happens. I should talk about the decline of the Ottoman Empire after the next event in the Islamic world, which is colonialism, imperialism. But the truth is, the problem with the decline and the end of the Ottoman Empire is that it lasted very long. It was in decline for a long time. And as it started to decline, and it became clear that it's declining, there are now pockets of activity that start to happen. It's like a very big empire where suddenly it becomes very weak in one area. And as a lot of thinkers say, the universe does not like a vacuum. You can never have a void. As soon as you have weakness or you have a void or you have a lack of power, some other power is going to replace. And so you start to see already with the decline of and you can say which one is happening first, you start to see calls for independence. Within the Ottoman Empire, there are areas that start to say, we want to be independent from you. We are so in disagreement with what you're doing and where you're headed. And the part of the big downfall of the Ottoman Empire is that they wanted to expand. They were already too big for what they could do and what they could control effectively. And they still wanted to expand. And no one understood why are you trying to expand further geographically? Why are you engaging in more and more wars and battles and trying to take more land from others? And all of this is resources that you do not have. When you have so many issues internally that you're not fixing, which are continuously eroding you from the inside. This is what happened to the Ottoman Empire. Inshallah, one day in the future, maybe we can talk more in detail about it. So this starts to happen. The logical conclusion politically, you have a huge empire, geographically speaking, on the world map that starts to decline. Logically speaking, therefore, you have areas that now want to become their own nations. I don't want to go down with the whole empire. I can become autonomous and have my own country. And within the Ottoman Empire, you have ethnic groups, you have religious groups. They can get together and form a country, right? A state. But that means that the intellectual now has to start thinking about, and this is the early thinking, the intellectual is now concerned with what? A very political, but a political question that has ramifications on every aspect of life. If this empire of ours, the Islamic empire, the only one that we know, completely collapses, what does it mean to live outside of an Islamic empire? What does it mean to have our own state? What does it mean to have our own identity? What does it mean to have our own language? What does it mean for us to practice our religion in however we want to live it? And then here, you see the seeds, the roots of a discussion that will continue to evolve in the Islamic world until today. What does it mean to live in a nation? What happens to our connection with the other Muslims? Are we still one or not? What unifies us? What happens to the language? And what do we do with religion versus and tradition versus the modern times? Because that's also part of what's happening. That the Ottoman Empire is falling because the West is now moving much faster towards industrialization and technology and scientific progress. So why is it that in the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic world, were not keeping up? We were the ones who gave them the technology. They learned from us for centuries. And now we're not even on par. We're not even equivalent. Now we're falling behind quickly. This is what's happening at that time. Okay, so now this goes on. It starts around the end of the 1600s, and the actual fall of the Ottoman Empire is 1922, right? That's the formal date, which means now we are past World War I and before World War II. So this is why it's a long period. I still put it ahead because those events started before the next one. But that is almost, and you can see the relationship between them because the next one is colonialism and imperialism. And here, the Muslim thinkers are now preoccupied. If you have an Ottoman Empire that is weaker and weaker, you have the big empires of the world, even though they were not still as powerful as they were before, who now have a much greater chance of actually being able to colonize you. And that's exactly what happened. And as this happens, especially by France, by Britain, and a little bit by Italy at that time, and maybe a little bit others, but especially in the Islamic world, like Portugal was less present. They were present elsewhere in Africa and elsewhere. As this happens in the Islamic world, now the intellectuals are concerned about, and the thinkers are concerned about when they think about the intellectuals, for instance, the question of language. What do we do with language? Do we stick to Arabic? Because that's what unified us with others, other states, other countries, others in the world, and this makes us stronger? Or do we go back to create our own national identity? This is how we're going to become stronger, because maybe we're not Arabs. We relied on Arabic because we're Muslims, and so of course you're going to have that as part of your formal education at some point, but what is the importance of a unified language in that Islamic world? That became a very big topic. There's a whole discussion around the education system. So now you have, and of course, in addition to all of this, now that you are becoming a colony and you are being colonized under an empire, you have foreign elements coming. You have foreign languages being imposed on you. Or, for instance, what happened in Turkey, that we're even going to get rid of the traditional way of writing. We're going to convert the letters to modern letters. This is how we're going to modernize. The question of language was very important, and the intellectuals were struggling with, and you see the discussion is, do I go tradition? Do I go modern? And what allows me to become stronger and more modern and better equipped to deal with this world? My nation state, or allying with the outside, where there is unity and there is common ground, for instance, around religion, around Islam, or around geography, or around ethnic groups, or. Right? So those were the major preoccupations. This caused a crisis of values, a crisis of culture at that time. And one of the questions that starts to emerge at that time, so this is the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, many of the intellectuals were now asking the question openly, how do we resist? We want to resist being colonized. What does that mean? What is the form of resistance that I should take? How do I maintain my identity and not lose it? What's the best thing that I could do? In any case. So then, this is where, in reaction to all of this, to these big questions, now we're going to have the answer. And the answer is, you see the emergence of a whole movement in the Islamic world that today very easily is labeled the Islamic reform movements. And these are end of 1800s all the way to about 1920, where you start to see these movements that are trying to bring Islam to its days of glory. And now you're going to have different schools of thought. A major school of thought that emerges at that time is the one that says we're going to clean up Islam from all the distortions that took place throughout the ages. And we're going to bring it back to its pure state, and that is what will allow us to witness and to experience the glory that we had before, and to become strong and powerful and deal with modernity. We're going to go back to how Islam was centuries and centuries ago, as it was practiced by the companions, by those who came at the time of the Holy Prophet and right after, the first and second and third generations of Muslims. We're going to go back to the Salaf. That's a Salafist movement. Everything else we're going to get rid of. We're going to clean it up. These were distortions that were introduced, and they are the reason why Islam is failing. It's not Islam. It's the Muslims who introduced all sorts of distortions into this faith and into this religion that we have now to clean up so that we bring it back to its pure state. We're going to go back to the fundamentals. I choose my words carefully so that you can make the linkages until today. So this is end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s. Then there's another movement that says, yes, we do need to clean up. We agree with you, but we don't agree with the how. The way we work in the world cannot just be that we're going to live how they were living 14 and 13 centuries ago. It doesn't make sense. We can't dress like them. We can't cut off completely like them and not learn their language and not learn their science and not learn their ways. No, we're going to go and learn everything they have to teach. We're going to go into their systems. We're going to educate ourselves and become powerful through what they have and bring everything that we know from our religion now that it's been purified. And this is what happens with the Muslim Brotherhood. The same Salafist thinking, but the tools are different. And that's why you start to see them in their families, in their groups. At that time, they start to send everyone to study in the West. And so they study in France and Germany and in other places. Why? And they don't wear the traditional dress anymore. They're all wearing ties and suits. It is Salafist thinking. But they disagreed on the methodology. I will no longer ride a camel in the desert. I'm going to ride the latest model car. And I'm going to dress like them and talk like them, using their tools and their language. And I'm going to rid my religion of all the distortions. And that combination allows me to be adapted and modern and powerful and effective at maintaining my identity. Because I believe that all the answers are within my religion, but that's what I will do. And that is another movement that emerges at that time. And then in their writings, we start to see the emergence of some of the big questions that exist until today in Islamic scholarship. How compatible is Islam with modernity? Is it 100% compatible? Halfway compatible? What do we do with the rest? Do we have the luxury of playing around with some parts of it? Where do we find the answers to this? How compatible is Islam with democracy? And a completely different political system that we did not know existed before, that is being imposed on us from the outside. How compatible is Islam with everything that is being called progress? So there's technology, there's industry, there's science, and there's culture and civilization. All of that is progress. How compatible is Islam with all of that? Do we just accept? Do we accept while adapting? Do we reject entirely? This is what the intellectuals are writing about. And this is where you start to see the emergence of some very important figures. I mentioned them in case you've heard of them, or I think you should know about them. So I just dropped some names. Today, inshallah, maybe in the future, we talk a little bit more about this. People like Sayid Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida, all of that movement that led to all sorts of things. This is where a lot of the thinking was happening at that time by their writing and all their very, very prolific activities at their time, dealing with these specific issues, coming up with theories and solutions and models to be implemented. We move to the now next event. Now in the world, we have the rise of nationalism and the nation state. This is in the West. In Africa, these are now the colonies, the countries that have been colonized under the empire. They start to revolt. They start to ask for their independence. So now we're in the mid to late 1800s, and they became nation states. So in return, now you have all of the intellectuals start to think about, if we colonize, so you have those in the West, if we colonize, if we want to become stronger, should the intellectual be more concerned about the national identity, or should they be more concerned about universals, whether it applies to my nation or not? And you had both. Both were very prevalent. And by the way, so when you study enough philosophy and you understand why someone like Nietzsche is considered so influential, is because he's saying you have to be the most powerful you can be, and you do not allow yourself to fall under any limitations, any weakness, any constraints. So you always think much bigger than just your nation, which is what they say Germany took and applied. We need to expand. We are so much bigger than these little geographic lines that have been drawn for us on our map. We're so much superior and so much greater than everyone else. It doesn't make any sense for us to be contained here when we have these great minds and these great abilities and we're superior to everyone else. In any case, so we continue. In the Islamic world, they're dealing with their own issues. While this is happening in the world, they are dealing with, now, again, another part of the answer. We saw one part of the answer, right? The decline of the Ottoman Empire, we don't know what to do, crisis. One part of the answer is those who say we're going to work on Islamic reform. The other part is we're going to work on the Arab Renaissance. All of the good that we are seeing in the world, in the Western world, and their ability to industrialize and the progress that we saw and all of that was triggered by what? By Renaissance. By their movement towards rationalism that we started the discussion with, right? So in the Arab world, they said, we're going to artificially generate and produce our own Renaissance. This is not how Renaissance works. No one generated and produced artificially Renaissance in the West. This is just a natural evolution of events. It reached a boiling point that people revolted against. That's what happened in the West. The way that the church and the state were working together and the conditions, the social conditions they created in society became so unbearable that people revolted against them and revolted against everything they represent, including religion, which never happened in the Islamic world. You never have a point in history in the Islamic world where people revolted against religion. Even in the worst of situations and the worst of cases, the masses never said all the misery and all the corruption and all the poverty that we're dealing with and oppression that is befalling us, the reason is Islam itself. We have bits and pieces of it, but it never reached a boiling point where people revolt against it that way, as it happened in the West. And that's why the Renaissance was possible in the West. But in any case, so in the Arab world, this is what's called the Nahda. And Nahda is the Arab Renaissance, or an attempt at an Arab Renaissance. So this is 1870s to about 1930s. The intellectual revival in the Arab world. So how are we going to do that? We're going to reform our educational system. We're going to make sure people really know their language. So here there are huge efforts made. And there are countries that jumped on this bandwagon, and a lot of money was invested to reform our educational systems. to create systems that are much more modern through schools, for instance, which did not exist in the Arab Islamic world at that time. They were relying on mosques and informal studying and so on and so forth. Completely different systems. We're going to modernize, and they started to replicate a lot of what they saw in the Western world with specific tools. For instance, the Arab language. Arabic itself has to become front and center in what we do. So huge efforts were made here. So a lot of introducing into the educational system, for instance, the Islamic and Arabic history. Our students need to understand our glory days so that they are inspired to go back to them. The amazing tales, the greatness of the Abbasids and Bani Umayyah and so on and so forth. So we have to go back to the golden days of Islam. And so the education system was injected with a lot of this, a focus on the Arabic language, a focus on history, a lot of translation from the West. We start to translate in the Arab world. They start to translate everything they can that is considered influential in the Western world is now being translated into the Arab world. So that we can catch up to what has been happening and that we equip ourselves and educate ourselves. And here the intellectual, a lot of the writing and a lot of the thinking here is all about how is the intellectual acting as an agent of educational reform? How is the intellectual contributing to educational reform? Because that's all that's needed. We know we have the capacity. If we just have the right education system, we're going to soon be able to generate a generation of people who are going to be able to lead us into the present and into the future. And so a lot of the movements were related to that. In the meantime, we go back to the West. This is when the Russian Revolution happens. So now we witness the Marxist thinking in practice being applied, which eventually leads to someone like Stalin becoming the ruthless tyrant in Russia, for instance. And here there's a whole discussion when it comes to the intellectual now. We come back to the discussion of class struggle. The intellectual is very preoccupied, no matter where they're writing from. Whether they're writing from South America or Africa or Europe or Russia, or everybody is concerned with class struggle. Even though the revolution happened in Russia, but it's creating sparks and triggering potentially a lot of other revolutions to happen. They may not. So everybody's preoccupied with this question. What is the cause? What is the root of class struggle? Is it good or is it bad? So intellectuals are very concerned with all of this. Should intellectuals participate in revolutionary movements or not? Should they be more objective and neutral? Or should they be in the revolution, leading or playing a role, or standing against it? Because there's a lot of misery and a lot of harm and a lot of destruction that happens with every one of these revolutions. You pay a very heavy price when you engage in this revolution. So should the intellectual participate in that price? Because you think it's so worth it that we will pay that price or not? A lot of discussions around that. And then we start to see, I'll come back to this notion of cultural hegemony. Hegemony meaning, you completely dominate. So in this case, the culture. What people think. How do you create that? So that everyone seems to be thinking the same thing. Where does that come from? What are the tools? What allows a group to control the mind of others this way? You go back 2-3 centuries ago, people were not thinking this way. So clearly something happened. You know that you move up 2 or 3 centuries in the future and people will not be thinking this, as impossible as it may be when you're in it. You know that all of this was going to go out the window and replaced by another culture. So what is it that allows this cultural hegemony to take place? Thinkers are very concerned with this question. And this still extends until today, by the way. And then we start to see more pronounced discussions on specifically some of the thinkers. They start to openly ask the question, what is the role of the intellectual? So before then, it was indirect. Now it's directly being asked. Who is the intellectual? Where do they come from? When we define intellectual, who falls in that category in society? And what is their role officially? What is it right now, and what should it be? Should it be the maintaining or the challenging of the status quo? Do they keep things safe and good and secure as they are because the devil is better? Or do they challenge the status quo and you participate and you contribute to the revolution? And a big question here is, who does the intellectual represent? Does the intellectual only represent himself? Does the intellectual represent the group from which they emerge? The socio-economic class from which they emerge? Do they represent the education system that produced them? The state system that produced them? The power relations that already exist, that they are now a participant in? Is that who they represent every time they talk, every time they take action? A whole discussion around that. World War I, World War II happened, which we have talked about. Crisis of civilization. All the progress and all the science and all the civilization of the West culminates in two extremely destructive, atrocious wars. The second one even worse than the first. Even though they said, okay, we learned our lesson, we'll never allow for this to ever happen again. We're going to create something that will become the United Nations later. We're going to get together, all the countries are going to work together. No more wars at this scale. We're going to self-destruct as a humanity. No one will be left. This is not who we are. This is not what we believe in. These are not our values. We don't understand. This was a fluke. And then 20 years later, a worse war happens. And this was World War II. And so this created a crisis in thinking. What led to this? And so the intellectuals here start to openly talk about what is the responsibility of the intellectual. Because none of this could have been what it was. Maybe it would have been a different version, but it could not have been this exact scenario had the intellectuals not participated. Had the intellectuals not allowed all of this to take place and contributed to this and played a very active role. What is the role of the intellectual? Really, they couldn't have done anything to stop or to slow down or to contain the scope, for instance. So there's a lot of discussion around that. Is the role of the intellectual to justify? Then you are complicit. Is the role of the intellectual to oppose the war? Then you are now an activist and you're going to pay a price. Then there's a whole discussion around the questioning of Western values. What are our values in the West? What do we actually believe in, given World War I and World War II? What are our values? We thought we knew. We are telling the whole world we are the civilized ones, and we're going to civilize them. And we're the ones who created World War I and World War II. It was just between us. So what are our values? And here, there's a whole discussion around, we talked about this, to what extent you align with your national identity versus greater values and more universal goals. And then here, one of the themes that emerged during this time is the failure of the West. There's books called The Decline of the West, for instance, written during this time. So now we understand why, right? The critique of modernity is during this time. There are so many books, very influential, very important books that talk about the crisis of the modern times. They start to take a negative position towards progress, towards science, towards technology. Very famous thinkers say it's not good. Today we're hearing the same thing, by the way. Anyone who has studied all of this and you know it, it's funny to see how history repeats itself. Suddenly, you have thinkers to say, we have to be very careful, AI is not a good thing, you can't just engage in it blindly. It replicates the exact same discussions that happened after World War II especially. We just saw what technology can do. It can create horrors. We cannot just let it run crazy, blindly without any constraints. We have to put regulation around it and constraints and all of that. Okay, so the more you understand these, the more you see that they're patterns that just repeat themselves. The over-reliance on science, for instance, that now you start to see those who say, well, science is a good tool, but there's no morality around it, and maybe it shouldn't be used and relied on blindly. And this is where we said the writings of Freud appear. And, he's trying to discover where are the dark, scary impulses in the human being. Where do they come from? That's what he's concerned with. Of course, in reaction to World War I and World War II. Okay, and then you have H.G. Wells, Simone Weil, and others, the critique of the West, critique of technology, critique of progress, and so on and so forth. Post-colonialism, decolonization. So now, after World War II, starting in the 1940s, all the way to about the 1970s, we start to see a lot of countries become countries after World War II. The world starts to slow down. And they say, okay, you had the big empires. The big empires are now taking a back seat. The UK is not trying to kind of dominate and colonize as they were before, no longer operating in that way. Overtly, I will come, I will colonize you, you are now my colony, these lines belong to me, and so, no more doing of that. And so quickly, you have movements that say, I want to be autonomous, I want to be my own state, I want to rule myself, so on and so forth. And so here, there's a whole discussion that starts to happen in the West. What is the role of the intellectual in the newly independent states? How will they allow and help those states to gain their own identity now that they have been let go by the empire that did everything for them and decide everything for them? Will they be able to self-determine? Will they be able to self-rule? Do they have the internal capacity to do that? So there's a discussion in the West about all of this. How do we change? How do we resist cultural hegemony? How do we create cultural, political autonomy? We become our own thinkers. We come up with our own political system. And we determine who rules internally from our own society. And determine for ourselves, what does our culture look like? Okay, intellectuals are busy in those topics, challenging the Western narrative. How the West has portrayed us and presented us and talked about us is not true. We are not who they say we are. We're not regressive. We're not second class. We're not uncivilized. We're not behind them. We're not inferior to them. They have things to learn from us. All of this is emerging at that time. We are our own states. And this is where you see a lot of the thinking of people who lived at that time and who came afterwards, because of course each one of these it creates a tradition, and then people work in that tradition. And it works both ways. Now I'm doing parallels. So this is happening in the West in general. So you have thinkers like Frantz Fanon and others writing about this. You also have people like Edward Sayid here. Edward Sayid being a Palestinian American scholar, Christian, living in the West, living in the US, who writes Orientalism. And we'll talk about it a little bit later. So this is where all of this is happening. It's all about post-colonial thinking. In the Arab and Islamic world, the same thing is happening, post-colonialism. We're becoming our own state formation. But what happens in the Islamic world, it happens everywhere else. But what we're preoccupied with is the rise of authoritarian regimes. This is what replaced the empire. The empire leaves, and now you have instead authoritarian, totalitarian, tyrannical regimes that start to appear. And so the intellectual is now going to deal with, think about the rise of authoritarian states, the rise of military rule, the rise of monarchs. It's like, is this what we asked for? Like everything we did and we wanted our own nation, is this what we were fighting for all along, that we get this at the end? So intellectuals are busy with that, and then they start to be oppressed. The oppression the intellectuals feel is coming directly at them. Now that they feel, okay, so the colonizer has left us, the empire has left us, okay, so now let's build. Yeah, every time you open your mouth and you try to say, I think we should, there's something that happens. And so they start to run away. Many of them are imprisoned. Many of them are killed. And the intellectuals start to talk about censorship, lack of freedoms, human rights, and all of that. That's the Islamic world. This is what's happening at the intellectual level in the Islamic world at that time. And some of them, they dare to openly talk about the failure of post-colonialism. The failed states that came out after colonization. In any case, the failure to deliver on the promises of independence. Next in the world, you have the Cold War. So now all of the other superpowers become a lot less significant, and only two emerge, one in the East and one in the West. USSR, Soviet, and the US. And the world has to ally itself. This creates a Cold War. They're not officially at war, but it creates tensions. Is it the capitalist system or the communist, Marxist, Leninist, and so on and so forth systems that should be the ones to rule the world? And so the intellectual is stuck in that dilemma. No matter what you do is reinterpreted as you are pro this and against that. Whether you are talking about it or not, it's constantly being reinterpreted that way. And so some intellectuals now start in the West to, they start to talk about responsibility. Fight for yourself and fight for your voice. You have your own voice as an intellectual. You don't belong to this or that tradition. This is Jean-Paul Sartre and Foucault and others. They start to appear here. And should the intellectual be engaged or not? Can the intellectual remain objective and neutral, or is everything that they do politicized one way or another, whether they like it or not, whether they say it or not, and so on and so forth? Then we have the movements of the 60s. This is where Foucault is. I mentioned him a little bit earlier, but he's in the extension of that in France and elsewhere. So in the 60s now we have the civil movements. Feminism, anti-war protests against Vietnam, all of those movements start to appear. So civil rights movements and, the rights of the blacks and so on and so forth, African Americans, it's all happening here. And again, this is when the intellectuals openly talk about. So yes, you have Foucault, but the towering figure who changed everything, and it created a huge legacy at that point, 1965 or 1967, now I have is the article that became a book by Chomsky. So at that time, Chomsky is a linguist, but a very engaged one. And so he starts to take very clear positions, and he writes a work called The Responsibility of the Intellectuals. And we're going to talk about it in a little bit. If we had more time in the series, or you guys are interested, I was going to go and identify passages from that work specifically to see whether they still apply in today's world and they are relevant or not. 1965. We're in 2024 now. Okay, but this has had a legacy. It's a legacy piece, a foundational text in this world of who is the intellectual, what should they do, what is their responsibility, and so on and so forth. He not only wrote something and published it, he took a stance and delivered it. And he was leading a movement and participating actively in movements. And so this is not only, theories changing minds, as there are people who are on the front lines, the Jean-Paul Sartre and Chomsky and others. They are contributing, they are participating in all sorts of various movements happening at that time. Do you justify the power of the state, or do you stand up against it, and so on and so forth? In the Islamic world, right after then, you have the Islamic revival. And this is when the Muslims who are in that stream of thinking, they organize themselves politically. So the things that we mentioned before, they were more at the cultural, religious level. Now they are organizing themselves politically. They are becoming political entities. They want to rule the state. Okay? So the big discussions happening in the Islamic world at that time is, do we return to religion? Do we move towards more secularism? How do we combine the two so that we create the best mix? A lot of thinking around that. And then you have globalization in the information age. We've talked about this. There are some very clear themes that emerge from this. The information is now traveling very quickly. So starting in the 1990s in the West, the big question is who is producing, who is disseminating, who is controlling information and knowledge. That's a big discussion. And then that means you're also producing and controlling culture. And you have the third discussion, the big theme, which is the democratization of knowledge. That knowledge is now democratic, as in accessible to all. You don't need to become an expert in something to have access to information. You Google it. Starting in the 1990s, because of technology. So the mix of globalization and information and digital economy. So that's what's happening in the West, and that leads to, we've talked a little bit about it, the death of expertise, or who is an expert, do we still need them, so on and so forth. And also at the same time, the emergence of the internet gurus. Are they really an expert if they are very famous on the internet, but specialists don't consider them a specialist? Okay? And all of this is relevant to us. We have the same phenomena in our world too. Okay? All of this happens. It's just usually with delayed effect, but happens. And then in the Islamic world, the intellectuals are now concerned, preoccupied with the spread of Western cultural products. The globalization is not just a globalization that, the things that you buy as a consumer, you're not just a consumer of things that you buy. You're also a consumer of culture. You're a consumer of ideas. This thing that I buy is part of a greater culture and it's connected to it. I'm buying not just a thing, as they call it, a commodity. I'm not just buying a commodity. I'm not buying something that has a dollar value to it and it's a material thing. This is connected to a lifestyle. It's connected to a culture. It's connected to a network of ideas and values and beliefs. And then when you look at movies, when you look at art, when you look at rights and legal systems and education system, now that becomes very clear. So the intellectuals are now, since then, very preoccupied in the Islamic and Arab worlds. What are we buying? What are we consuming? What should we be doing as intellectuals in all of this? What is our role? Okay? How do we become a lot more less dependent, more independent from all of that so that we actually can create our own culture or maintain a culture? That's another big question during that time when we are relying on the Western infrastructure for everything we want to do. So in any case, you want to have your own presence online, but you have to rely on Facebook and YouTube, and which are Western platforms and so on and so forth. Okay, there's a lot of talk about cultural imperialism. So we're no longer talking about, the geographic and then the forced coercion that came with the previous version of imperialism, colonialism. Now it's kind of a soft version of it. It's indirect. It infiltrates your culture and it takes over, and then you are part of me without even realizing it, and you're working for me and my interests in everything you do and everything you say and everything you eat and everything you wear and everything you buy and so on and so forth. Okay, and then so since the 1900s, the main trend is that there's an ongoing tension between tradition and the intellectual world of Islam, between what is tradition and what is modern. And are they compatible or not? This has been going on for a century and a half very clearly, between the religious and the scholar, but the role or the presence or the ability of Islam to be in the public sphere, to lead public life, to be present in the public sphere, and so on and so forth. So this is what we covered, and I spent too much time. I thought that I would go faster in this way of reconnecting things. We are looking at all of this from the point of view of Muslim minorities living in the West. So we said all of this converges into us with an added layer of complexity. We are inheriting everything that has come down through the tradition of the West, because we are in the West. And that's the reality that the Western world has dealt with. This is why they are where they are today. Because they've dealt with all of this, they've taken position, they've decided on things, let go of other things, they've evolved, matured, made mistakes, until they landed where they are today. And we are part of this. This is what we're witnessing. It didn't just happen in a vacuum. And we also come with all of that baggage that happened in the Islamic world. Whether we're aware of it or not, our thinkers, our writing, our culture is all fed by all of these events. And we are disconnected from the Islamic world geographically. Sometimes generations, sometimes not. And we are living in the West, not only just living in the West as we are, but clearly we are an adapted or transformed or modified version of the Muslim as we live in the West. We're not as is raw, as the Muslim would have been. Let's say you take someone from the 1950s living in the Islamic world, you plop them here, and this is a Muslim that you get today. In your typical Islamic Muslim minority living in the West. That's not what it looks like at all. We're very different in our thinking, in our values, in our beliefs, in our worldview, in our all of that. So there's another layer. And this is why we say this discussion is not irrelevant to us. It may seem that it's very theoretical and very abstract, but the truth is, this is our reality. Day in and day out, this is our reality. And so it requires a little bit of thinking. Where is the intellectual in all of this? And what is the relationship of this intellectual with the religious scholar? And in fact, who is the intellectual? Is the definition that we gave good enough? Does it resolve the issue? Do we know how we need to be and how we need to deal with it as a community? How we structure ourselves, the roles that we give to each other as intellectuals in this world? So in any case. Now, I thought I would give a quick overview of some of the themes. So I'll cover what I can and then we'll stop, depending on how late it seems to be getting for us. The discussion that we just went through, if we wanted to kind of break it down into all of the major themes and all of the major thinkers and all of their main ideas and the works that they wrote and how they reacted to each other and with all their nuances, like that's a full series on its own, right? We're not doing that. So I'm simply highlighting a couple of the biggest themes that have to emerge from all of this that we have to take note of. And those are going to be very relevant to us later in the discussion. At least I'll try to cover one maybe. If we have time and you guys have the patience for me, we might cover two. I had three to cover. So the first one has to do with power structures. If there's one takeaway from the whole discussion that we just had, so I'm focusing on the West now. Takeaways from everything we covered. The first one is that in the West, the thinking, the intellectuals, those who thought about this whole question, they are very preoccupied with, they have given a lot of attention to the question of power structures. Power is not just something random that, is an empty, abstract notion. No. In the West, they started to analyze this notion of power, especially in the state or in society. What does it mean? Where does power come from? What does it look like? And they started to identify systems and tools and mechanisms that give you power. There are actions that you take that give you power. There are things that you do that will preserve the power. There are things that you do that will take the power away from others. And in fact, every action, if you go far enough, depending on which sociologists you read and which school you belong to, they will explain every movement or, action, let's say, or decision being made by human beings in their lives based on this. If you decide to do this or not, it's because of power. You want more power or less, at least not to lose the power that you already have. And this can apply at a very high level. It can apply at a very micro level too. Small decisions. Why would you become more friends with so-and-so? Because they have power and you don't. Getting closer to them gives you more power. Right? Like that's a psychological aspect, but it's sociology. A lot of the big sociologists were thinking in those terms. Society is a system. You remove the human being is just another piece, another material piece in this, right? Another of the wheels that move around. Everybody is following the same trajectory, ruled by the same laws. And the same thing happens to societies and states. Same thing happens to social classes and groups. Why do you do this? Why don't you do that? Well, do you want to gain more power? Do you want to preserve the power you have? Do you not understand that this makes you thought it would give you more power, but it makes you weaker, and so on and so forth. So that's a general discussion of the power structures. So I wanted to mention at least two big names here. The first one is Antonio Gramsci. So Antonio Gramsci is a Italian thinker, philosopher, linguist, who was politically active. So he lived from 1891 to 1937. Not a very long life. 1891 to 1937. In 1926, he was imprisoned by Mussolini. And in 1937, he died in prison. In prison, he wrote his major works are called the notebooks, the prison notebooks. So he left over 30 notebooks that became works that you can read today. And this is where you see his thinking, and he talked about a very wide range of topics, starting and stemming from, political philosophy, but it touched on a lot of aspects of life. And he is one of the thinkers. So his thinking is an extension of Marx. He's 100% a Marxist thinker, but many call him a neo-Marxist because he introduced a lot of elements and took Marx's thought much further. He talks directly about who is the intellectual, what is their role in society, who do they represent, and that is a contribution that no one really had asked in this way before. Who does the intellectual represent? And he starts to make the distinction between what he calls the traditional intellectual and the organic intellectual. He says that traditional intellectual is the one who simply represents the education system. You just go through the movements and everybody knows they're all the same throughout history. The clergy and the philosophers, they're educated in a certain way, mathematicians, whatever. But then you have the classes who were not really represented before. The urban areas, coming from, far away farmers that were not really known to be a part of that social class. And now they are part of it. Does that person, when they become an intellectual, an accomplished intellectual, do they represent the urban world from which they came? Or are they now part of the elite that educated them? And can they become an intellectual without going through that path or not? Can they have the same influence and so on and so forth or not? So he talks about that everyone in society can play if they choose. Very important thought for us. If they choose to, everyone in society can play an intellectual function. It's something accessible to all. And he goes, so therefore to him, the intellectual is beyond an academic role. He does not consider the intellectuals to be a class apart. They are directly linked to the group from which they emerge. But the group can be the educational group, or it can be the actual socio-economic class that produced them. Interest in uncovering who shapes and maintains, and that's the other area of his contribution, who shapes and maintains cultural hegemony. Today we talk about it. No one had really talked about it before him. He's the one who introduced this notion. Who shapes cultural hegemony? Cultural domination. Gramsci. Who shapes it? And who maintains it in place? And the big question is, to break down that question is going to be, how does the state, how does wealth control Power. What are the mechanisms that they use to control power, to keep power and maintain it? And his answer is, they do this mainly and effectively not through violence, not through coercion, but through culture and through cultural institutions. The school, anything that belongs to the culture. It could be art. It could be anything that affects what you consider to be culture. I don't need to come and dominate you with force. I don't need to use violence. I don't need to use an army. I can rely on, today they call it in the Arab world, they call it al-quwa al-na'ama. Soft power. Or what he called cultural hegemony. I don't need to do anything else. This is how I maintain power. I don't need to confront you. I don't need to coerce you. I don't need to force you. I don't need to use violence, and so on and so forth. And so the big question here is going to be, and where does the intellectual fit into all of this? Is this possible? Is it possible to create cultural hegemony without the intellectual? It's not. The intellectual is the one who's doing all of this. Okay? So, a quick note that, of course, this is going to be much more relevant later, and we're going to stop here, that he was clearly the type of intellectual. He's not saying anything. When you read his works, or at least that I know of, the ones I've read, he's not telling the intellectual, you have to do this, you shouldn't do that, this is your moral duty, this is an obligation, as we will see with other thinkers. He doesn't say that. He's just describing, analyzing and describing. But if we look at his life, clearly he was engaged, an engaged intellectual, committed to his causes, imprisoned. He was a political leader. He created his own political party, and he was imprisoned for that, and then he died in prison at a young age. So clearly he would fall in the category of the thinkers who believe that the intellectual is also someone who is fighting for something. You're committed, you're an activist, you play an active role. It's not just theory and notions, you throw them out there and whatever happens, as we will see with others, for instance. We said his work is simply an extension of, I consider it to be just an extension of Karl Marx, but very rich and a completely different background, focused on economic and class struggle, and that's the extension of Marx. For him, the intellectuals, often they reflect the interests of the dominant and economic class. And they contribute to the perpetuation of ideological systems that justify class inequality. So to him, the intellectual, even though he would probably consider himself to be an intellectual, and you see him clearly fighting against this, to him the intellectual, by default, the intellectual is going to be someone who is going to allow all of this cultural hegemony to take place and will work in ways, the products, the ideas, the speeches, the writing, the tools that the intellectual uses are going to help perpetuate the inequalities that exist in the system. That's his main position. Even though I don't think he says it in this way. But the way he writes, he doesn't really say, my position from the intellectual is a positive one, the intellectual is good, a force for good in society, nor does he say it's a force for bad. He's just trying to describe the situation. He says at the end, cultural hegemony is only possible through the contributions and the active participation of these experts who know how to get this done without really thinking. Because in a lot of cases, they don't want to reflect on what is it that they're contributing to. You're an expert in communications, we want you to do this. You're an expert in economy, we want you to do that. We can't do it by ourselves. We need you to do it because you're the expert. You're an intellectual. But at the end, all of this together means that we control what people think, how people think, and we ensure that not much else is available, possible. And so his main point is, as I look at all of this, he's saying, at these power structures, I can see that they would not be possible without the contribution of the intellectual. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here. Inshallah, next time we'll continue with the role of Foucault, because Foucault really focused on power structures. No, so Fukuyama is an American Japanese thinker, very conservative economist. Michel Foucault is a French philosopher and historian, and we'll talk a little bit in the same vein. He talks about a notion called episteme. So the episteme is a general culture that he's calling the cultural hegemony. He calls it something different. If you go back enough in history, by the way, you'll see very similar writing from Plato. Okay, he calls it the doxa, Plato. Okay, it's the general worldview and beliefs and ideas held by the masses. So where does that come from? So Foucault focuses on things that become a lot more intellectual. It's not just talking about the masses. It's a lot more sophisticated. Why do intellectuals think this way? We can just finish Foucault since we started. When you go in a group of people who are called scientists, why do they think this is science and this is not science? People who are artists, these are the specialists, these are the intellectuals. Why do they say this is, in French he would say, this is sayable, you can say this here and you can't say this here. Who decides that? It's the episteme. There's an overarching culture in which you are embedded that you are not aware of, that you're not conscious of. And he says, once again, he takes a very openly, we would again say, he is being negative towards the intellectuals. He says the intellectuals are the ones participating unconsciously in this creation of this episteme, of this way of thinking that everyone is unconscious about. And they are the ones who are creating it and maintaining it in place. And they are not even aware that they do this. So he says we have to do something that allows us to undo all of this and uncover all of this. I was supposed to mention some of his important works and so on and so forth. I'm just looking at my notes. And all of this episteme, he makes a point to say, is very relative. So if you look at what is held as belief, as common by a certain group today, it would be very different than what was held by the same group a century ago. Which means that it's relative. Which means that this is not something that just happens by itself. There's something happening that makes them think this way. And say this is sayable and this is not. This is acceptable here and it is not. Where does this come from? And so this is where he goes into the tool that became associated with his name, what he calls the archaeology of knowledge. He says we're going to dig. We're going to do a lot of digging. We're going to do archaeology to uncover the forces that created the episteme that everyone is unaware of, unconscious of. What led to this? He's going to say, I'm not interested in this thinker. I'm not interested in that thought and that idea. That alone tells me nothing. I have to look at everything working under the full landscape, under the scenes. That led to this type of thinking being generated and being maintained. This is what he calls the archaeology of knowledge. And then he applies it. You know, why does suddenly society say that this is called madness? And he writes a full book on madness. What is madness? The prison system. And he talks about the prison system. Or the healthcare system. What is sayable and not? What is acceptable and not in that system? Which changes over time. So he tries to, but that's the work of, a good historian, sociologist, philosopher, that he presents these cases as his evidence for all of this. And so he says that there are patterns of language, patterns of thinking, ideas that the intellectuals, the scientists, the scholars are going to use, and those are going to be all together taken. They give you the episteme. Once you start to recognize those patterns because you've been trained by them, now you belong to that tradition. You belong to that school. You've been allowed in. You can speak their lingo. You can speak their language. They will accept you in as part of, and so on and so forth. And this is what goes in society as well, and this becomes what is sayable or not, or acceptable and not. But all of this means that the intellectuals are embedded in the power structures. They are part of them. They're not outside. They're not objective. They're not neutral. They're not above. They're not so smart and so intelligent and so analytical and critical that they see that this is all happening to them just like it's happening to everyone else. Okay? So they are embedded in the same system. It's reflected in the assumptions underlying all of their work. And that's why he calls them functionaries of the discourse. So a functionary is like we would say it's a muwaddaf, it's like you're employed by an employer. You're employed by the government, that's a functionary, right? You don't really think for yourself. You're told and you do as you are told. So who is your boss in this case? When you're a functionary, you perform the function of the discourse. The mass of everything that is said, the mass of everything that is presented, that's the discourse. It's not a specific, it's not this discourse or that. It's all of it together is the discourse. And you are a functionary of, you're a function of it, and this is what you push out. You repeat the mass understanding around a culture, a topic, a field. Later, because he didn't really talk about this point earlier, he just kept it at that level, he didn't engage. So I would have said, he's not really politically, he's not saying so therefore what? But in later lectures, he talked about it, and it became a book, The Courage to Truth, it's called in English. It's a series of lectures that he gave. And in those he said that the intellectual should have the courage to speak the truth. Now we have engagement. Now we have a should. Now we have the moral judgment added. He says the intellectual should have the courage to speak the truth and to challenge dominant ideologies. Now he's taken a very clear position. And in his own life, he is well known to have been politically active in some selective causes. He was politically active. So of course, this is where you always have to turn it against them. Like if you want to be critical about their thought. If he says all the intellectuals are always part of the episteme, and they cannot go beyond it and they're not conscious of it, then wouldn't we say that he's part of the same thing? So he's an intellectual. He's just an extension. He's just a functionary of the discourse that has generated him. He's just repeating what his episteme is. Would he agree with that? Of course he wouldn't, because he said, I found the tool and I'm giving it to you. It's the archaeology of knowledge. You apply this to every field, so it means not everyone has fallen into this. But he's generalizing, and he's saying in general, these power structures are not possible without the intellectuals, and the intellectuals are not conscious themselves that they are contributing to this, but they are. And so it's not a very positive relationship with the intellectuals, even though he is one. Same thing with Gramsci, right? So in both cases, they are saying by default the intellectual is the one who is part of, and in fact the one who shapes and maintains the power structures. When in fact they should be challenged, they should be criticized, they should be analyzed, they should be...
Is it due to reactionary thought or manipulation that they do that? Like reacting to what's previously there?
Are you talking about intellectuals or those two thinkers? And the
Intellectuals that are participating in the continuing this culture of hegemony.
Yeah.
Just because they're reactionaries to the previous set of thoughts? Okay.
They just extend and continue, and they're not aware. They are not even aware that they are part of, or what are they contributing to by their actions, and so on and so forth.
Or they are aware, but they're not objective. They're part of the power structure.
And they don't have the tools. So in his case, he's basically saying, so unless you apply my methodology of archaeology of knowledge, you are not going to have the tools to be able to uncover all of these deep structures and show what the episteme is. And then be aware of it, and then be careful from it, and know how to react to it. Yeah. Okay, let's stop here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آله. Yeah, maybe it was a little bit longer. تفضلوا.
My question was, correction, but maybe they are, because I was just wondering, like, the last part focused less on the thinkers in the Islamic world, I feel like, and I had another layer of complication to add. If I was thinking of there's the Western movement of worldview, there's the Islamic worldview, and in our case, there's the Shia worldview. And you talked about Jafar, who was, I believe, the teacher of Ali Sharia. And I was thinking maybe I was wondering actually if you were going to talk a little bit of how the Shia worldview.
Yes, so excellent question. That do we want to talk about the Shia worldview? 100% yes, and we will talk about it. It is part. This is where the series is going. So inshallah, I thought I'd finish a little bit more today with the Western worldview. So inshallah, we'll finish it. Maybe next time we won't recap. We'll just jump into it, and we'll maybe start. So the idea was that we present the Islamic worldview because the Shi'i thinkers are also not working in a vacuum, right? They are working in the greater Islamic context. So we understand a little bit in a similar way the big themes and big thinkers, and then we move towards the Shi'i worldview. And unfortunately, I'm going to say, we will see that there have not been many attempts. And there have been a few, and those are the ones where we will talk about, where it goes to that level where we say like there is a clarity of vision on the intellectual and the role and the relationship and so on and so forth. When there is attempts, we will see that there's a little bit of regurgitation and repetition of what was mentioned, and there's just a few names and not many more. And of course, Shari'ati is one of them. Even though that said, I try not to present the thought. It should not matter whether the thinker, for instance, in Islamic thought, it should not matter whether the thinker is a Muslim or not, right? Because what we're concerned with is the tools, the intellectual tools. Are they Islamic tools or not? So the same thing should be said about, for instance, Shi'i thinkers. It's not whether he is labeled, Shi'i or not. That's irrelevant to this discussion. It's more, what are they relying on as intellectual tools? Do those tools come from the Shi'i tradition or not? That's what we're interested in. And so we'll see, to me, and I could be wrong, I think there's a scarcity, unfortunately. Given the importance of the question, given the attempts at dealing with it and its relevance and the pressing need for it, there should be a lot more attempts with a greater variety or diversity of thoughts and solutions and attempts, but it's not the case. So yes, there is little enough that I decided that I would talk about it because it's not going to take us too far. And there are some discussions that can get very technical. We're not going to get into them. But yes, I'll talk about it, inshallah. Yeah, it's coming soon, inshallah. تفضلوا.
So I just have a take. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. But if I want to go back to, for example, I feel like it's somewhat linked, like the rise of Prophet Jesus, alayhi salam. In our Islamic ideology, he would be the intellectual during his time. However, correct me if I'm wrong, but he didn't come with physical power. So he was kind of like oppressed and by the Roman Empire, which was the opposite intellectual at the time being. And so once he was eliminated, even if it was like hypothetically speaking, but in the world, in the physical world, it was not there anymore. So it's like basically like killing him, killing his image. So I feel like there's always two forces of intellectual, like when our Prophet, peace be upon him, came, and Imam Ali alayhi salam after him, there was always that intellectual and goes hand to hand with power and dominance. So for example, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he had Imam Ali with him, and I feel like from what Imam Ali alayhi salam says is that it's not that Muawiyah, because Muawiyah tried to go like head to head with Imam Ali, not like physically because he wasn't as brave, but with his tricks, and so I feel like one of the tools that yeah, so I feel like
pseudo-intellect.
yeah, so I feel like the opposite, like the opposite force of intellectual is that they have the tool of kind of like trickery or whatever you want to call it, whereas kind of like the intellectual that should, as the philosopher speak the truth, he doesn't have that tool, or he's not allowed to pursue that tool. So they have an advantage at that level, but not really an advantage, but an advantage where the culture allows it to be. And somehow the majority of the culture leans toward that, so they kind of feed into that power. So like pushing down, like as you were speaking, it came to my mind the verse from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 102. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم واتبعوا ما تتلو الشياطين على ملك سليمان وما كفر سليمان ولكن الشياطين كفروا يعلمون الناس السحر وما أنزل على الملكين ببابل هاروت وماروت وما يعلمان من أحد حتى يقولا إنما نحن فتنة فلا تكفر فيتعلمون منهما ما يفرقون به بين المرء وزوجه until the end of the verse. So I feel like yes, in in a sense it talks about magic, but it also talks about like in our world there's a lot of like discussions about how the society we live in the Western world, it leans into the division or the separation of the family foundation, and I feel like everything stems from a family, right? Then there is the social, then there's a community. So if that right there is broken, right? You can use different words like sihr or like tricks or manipulation, or so I feel like many of the intellectuals nowadays, they have to have like kind of like you said, like kind of like the green light, to be an intellectual, or else you'll be out of the map or out of the picture, and you won't have a voice. And talking about like the tools that we have nowadays, which is like social media and the iPhones and all that. I was reading a lecture and it was talking about how near the end of times, that when Imam Mahdi alayhi salam comes out, one of his kind of that makes him stand out is he answers all the questions. Going back to the first Imam where he says, ask me before you miss me, before I know the paths of the skies or the heavens more than the earth. So I feel like I would always imagine that they would have some sort of opposition intellectual where he would answer all the questions, but I feel like even in our time, I was at work and my manager was kind of like talking about advertising, and then one of my coworkers was like, hey, did you use these ideas from ChatGPT? And it's like, it's so like out there right now that even like as simple as an app is answering all your questions. And where would that take us going forward? So do you think that maybe in the future that we need to find replacing tools that works towards the authentic intellectual, or use the same tools, or we will be using the same tools but towards the advantage of the truthful intellectuals overall,
You covered a lot. My thinking is always, it's kind of unpredictable to see how it goes. But to me, it's always, we have to work with the general principles. And we are going to have to create new tools and adapt them and make use of them. As opposed to thinking that whatever has worked until now will work forever. No. So it means that we have to build expertise, and we have to get involved, and we have to, whatever tools, mechanisms, abilities exist, we have to see what can I do, what good can I do with this. I think that's like, it should go without saying that we operate in this way. That's one. Now the rest of what you covered, you brought up very interesting ideas. For instance, what you mentioned about Prophet Isa alayhi salam, that's a whole discussion on whether, what tools are available to prophets in general. It depends on the mission they are sent with, but it seems that these high-ranking prophets, whatever conditions allow them to achieve, they will achieve it. And so, had he been able to use the forces of his time to do more, he would have. Like no different than what Imam Ali alayhi salam did politically or militarily, let's say, is very different than, let's say, what Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam did militarily and politically. And it's not because they have a different belief, right? The circumstances and the conditions of their society are different. So in the case of Imam Ali alayhi salam, he still had people who agreed to stand by his side and to do this. And it made sense for him to act in this way. Whereas in the time of Imam al-Kadhim, this would not have been at all possible. This is not how he would have been effective. This is not how he would have been able to better spread the truth. So in the same way we would say with Prophet Isa alayhi salam. Otherwise, we do not have anything that would tell us, for instance, Prophet Isa was really not sent with, any mission to try to impose the truth further and to extend and communicate, spread the truth more than if he could have, he would have. The only reason he didn't is because the conditions didn't allow him. Same thing with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You compare his time in Mecca to Medina, very different. And the only thing that changed is the circumstances. So we could say, مثلا, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was closer to Prophet Isa alayhi salam while he was in Mecca. And in Medina, his circumstances changed, and so he went in a very different direction. But you then added the complexity of the scheming and the other tools that exist, and 100%. The beauty of the verse that you mentioned is exactly that notion. I think that answers your question. If your question is going there, I don't know. It's that the same tool can be used for good or evil. And it seems that in this verse, that's exactly what it's saying. That there's a tool, in this case called magic, that may be used to create disunity and fighting and problems between people who are supposed to be together. But the same tool can also be used. If people understand how this tool works, then they would not fall for its trickery, or they would be able to fix it. That's what the verse is saying. So the verse is saying the angels, Harut wa Marut, what the angels are doing is teaching people how to use it to fix what others created in terms of harm and danger and disunity and problems. But the only way to do that is to know that tool. If you don't have that tool, then you don't know how to deal with it. Right? You have to gain that expertise. That's why they're teaching them. So you can't just block off the door and say, but this is all wrong. Okay, but if it's all wrong, you'll never be able to deal with it. The only way to deal with this is to know enough about it so that you are able to fix the wrongs that were committed using it. It's like someone saying, I don't know, like a simple parallel. Someone who creates, while coding, they create a code that it becomes a computer virus. Well, the only way to know what is actually happening here and understand it is to also learn computer coding. Hatta you either deal with it directly or you create another code so that you can fix what has been. That's the same thing.
They call it as ethical hackers.
An ethical hacker, yes. You're using it for good only. Right? So to me, the verse is talking about that, which is a very deep but very insightful topic. And it doesn't talk about this topic a lot. It's only a few key verses in the Quran that talks about this. But this is very important, very powerful, very important. So I don't know if this is where your mind was going when you were talking about, for instance, it would be the same thing. Because Imam Ali alayhi salam is who he is and he has the knowledge, he can expose what Muawiyah is doing. If I don't know scheming, then I wouldn't recognize it when Muawiyah does it, and it's right in front of me and I don't know that it's happening. Right? And I don't know if this goes in line with the other question, which is therefore we have to create other. Yes, we have to gain expertise and understand what these tools are and how are they used and how we can use them for the good. And that's it. I have nothing else to say about that.
I think like for example, in the Western world, if to like align with what you're saying is to, you know, the light army is what you call it, right? What you call it, Na'im, Jaysh Na'im, or something like that?
الحرب الناعمة.
Harb al-Na'im. So I think like that's the only, not the only, but that's I think the most effective approach, you know, to actually have some sort of like, even if it's you know, like small percentage of impact.
Yes.
Towards a change, because of course all of that like.
So you mean for us to effect change?
It doesn't have to be a Muslim. For someone who has ethics as an intellectual, to kind of survive.
Yes.
Where you don't have much chance of surviving if you oppose what you're being taught. Right?
Yes.
From the intellectual. So I feel like you kind of have to somewhat play the role of the Lord in his time.
For instance, but it can take any form. And like, let's be honest. يعني, it may seem like it's a very, inshallah, we're going to talk about this. I didn't know if I talk about it as part of this series or I wanted to keep it as a separate series. Like at the very end of the series, just have a theme on this. But يعني, this has to do with how you affect change in the world. How is this different? It is different. But how is it different? When the Imams say, for instance, كونوا دعاة لنا بغير ألسنتكم. What is the Imam saying? Isn't this حرب الناعمة? He's saying, use the softest of tactics. No need for coercion, violence, aggressiveness. You don't even need to be direct. Don't even use your mouth. Don't even use words. Act in a way that is attractive to people. That's it. So, how is it different? Well, in one way, it's not different at all. They think they know Al-Harb al-Na'imah. Our Imams taught us a lot an'am. Right? It's that, there's nothing softer than that. It's completely indirect. Completely nothing. As subtle as it comes. The difference is, what is the objective? What are you trying to accomplish with this? And are you using anything devious here? No. Are you scheming? Are you distorting truth? No. Are you lying? No. You're only being strategic. That's the difference. And you said, you know, it's like I would say simply, it's one person is giving themselves the right to cheat and the other is not. That's the disadvantage you mentioned, right? One of them will cheat and the other will say, I will not cheat. I'll play by the rules, right? Something like that. When you said, for instance, Imam Ali and Muawiyah, and he says about Muawiyah, ma Muawiyah adha minni, and all of that, right? So in this case, we don't believe, like I don't want someone to come now, take this and say, oh, the Imams say you're going to use the same tactics as the Harb al-Na'imah. Well, yes and no. The Imams are saying be strategic in how you be effective. Right? You want to be optimal way of use of your power and your time and your effort and your expertise, and this is how you do it. You can do this in a lot less time with a lot greater effect, but you're not lying, you're not distorting. So the way you do it, you never give a false impression to anyone about anything, one, and the outcome is I will bring you to heaven. And in both of these, the other side cannot say that. Because the other side will do the softness, but will use on top of it lying and cheating and corruption and distortion and all of that. And I will bring you to hell. Right? I will bring you in the opposite direction. I'm not doing all of this for a greater good, for your greater good. I'm doing this for my own personal interest. But the idea behind it is the same. And the idea behind the verse is the same. Magic is magic. But we're going to teach you magic so that you can undo the magic that has been done to you, that has wrecked and destroyed society. You need to know enough of it so that you can deal with it. Yeah.
Oh, sorry if I took him over the questions, but to top it with another question, is like, for example, like, I don't know if this verse relates or not, but when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يُؤْمِنُ أَكْثَرُهُمْ إِلَّا وَهُمْ مُشْرِكُونَ. So us being in this Western world, Western society for, like you said, for decades, and it's so dominant, and like you said, like the United Nations and all that, so it's kind of a very similar ideology, whether you're in the US or in Canada or in Britain, etc. So let's say you try to follow the Prophet's advice, which is to hold on to the Book of Allah and Ahlul Bayt. And I've done like minimal research, and it comes down to the point where, like, for example, the Milak al-Imam is the ilm. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ. So knowledge is I would say, like, the top chain for power, right? Or right now, like you said, how it converted to money. Well, of course, there's intellectuals behind it, right? So there is that knowledge. So if I try to, like, for example, seek my knowledge from those two sources, which is Ahlul Bayt and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, don't you think that I'm also at the same time consciously or subconsciously kind of got a sharik, or also adding the knowledge I'm receiving from the Western world, and therefore my source of knowledge is corrupted, whether I know it or not. So therefore I'm blended in with the rest of the intellectuals.
Yes. So I understand what you're saying. So here, this is where it depends. So if you think that you are someone, or someone needs to tell you, if you can't assess it for yourself, that cannot immunize yourself against the thoughts that come in, and you no longer can determine that this is truth and this is not truth. This is from God and this is not from God. If you're no longer able to do that, or you are too influenced by what is coming from the other side in your actions or in your beliefs, then you're in trouble. And if the solution is, I go elsewhere, in the Islamic world, and I'm not going to be exposed to these thoughts, then of course it becomes obligatory to go there. That's in short. So I don't know if that's the question you're asking.
I'm saying from on average, like as a because the discussion is about intellectuals in the Western world. Right?
Yes.
So speaking of if I want to, for example, judge intellectuals in the Western world,
Yes.
or everyone to play a part as an intellectual, do you think that it could be possible to be authentic and to be free from the environmental influence, or do you think that's always questionable and always needs some sort of review?
So now you're asking my personal belief. My personal belief is that if you live in a society long enough, you will be influenced by its thoughts. This does not mean that you are going to be corrupted, or that you're going to be... This is not always and necessarily a bad, negative thing. There is a certain dose of that is also acceptable. It's what are the ideas that are influencing you? Are you aware and conscious of them or not? Are you sufficiently immunized for the parts that are truth to you and to your family and so on and so forth? Are you sufficiently immunized that you can deal with that? Or is it slowly getting eroded? And so I don't think the answer is like black and white. You are influenced. I think every human being is influenced. But we have plenty in our fiqh and in our religion, history and otherwise, that says a certain dose, a certain amount of that is fine. And in fact, this is where I have to take it to the next level and bring it back to the discussion we just had, which is you have to know this. You have to. Like, let's be open, transparent. And when you study philosophy, or when you study, philosophy may be too complicated, but it's the same thing. Let's say when you study kalam, what do? All you're doing is exposing yourself to other thought, other beliefs, and you're countering. He's saying when it comes to the belief in God, so and so group believe this, and that about God. Point number 1, we agree. Point number 2 is questionable, and point number 3 is complete falsehood because it leads to kufr or shirk, depending on whether they say this or that. By doing this, you're exposing yourself to falsehood. You know this is false. The book says this is kufr, and you are sitting here studying this for weeks or months. You are exposing yourself to kufr all the time. But how else will you learn? And how else will you immunize yourself against this thinking? And that's why I say it's not black and white. That just because you're exposed to it, you're influenced. You might be influenced. We're all human beings. There's a dose of influence that will happen. Now, so that's one part. That's the more theoretical part. The more practical part. So, in his time, the Holy Prophet ﷺ tells, and I think I mentioned this last week, the Holy Prophet tells a group of Muslims, the context here, the social context that we live in Mecca is so unbearable that you need to travel and leave me. At that time, there is no internet and there's no social media with WhatsApp, 72,000 messages a day, and there is no books, and there is no schools, and there is no preachers, and there's nothing. There's a tiny group of, 30 to 70 people. 30, closer to 30, who leave Mecca. And they go all the way to Africa to live among the Christians there. Completely disconnected, cut off from their ideological base. It's not that easy for them to ask questions from the Prophet. You can't text him. You can't send your email to the office. Right? They're on their own now. And this is early Islam. And Islam is still being revealed. We are not yet at the complexity. And the Holy Prophet tells them, it's better for you to be cut off from all of this and go live a more dignified life and try to make it there. And with time, years later, some of them came back and some of them never came back. And the Prophet never ordered anyone to come back. It's up to them. Some of them wanted to come back, they came back. Some of them, they established themselves in there, in Habasha, and they stayed there. Well, that's it. Right? And so, wouldn't you say that this is a miniature version? It's not to the extent and complexity that we have today. But you have an example. There's a lot more when we go through history with the imams and so on and so forth. But that as an example, wouldn't you consider that to be an example of a situation where you have Muslims at the time of the Holy Prophet that he is sending away, cutting off, sending in a world where they are a minority. They are going to be 100% exposed to beliefs that we would consider to be not true, that will influence them, distort them, and some of them did convert to Christianity. And they left Islam. If you study the history of who went and what happened to them, some of them left Islam. Is there a risk? 100%. Today, with hindsight, we would say, to them, it should have been forbidden to stay because they were not immunized. And others came back as strong in their belief as when they left because they were immunized. But no one can say that from the outside. And that's why I said, if you can self-assess, and no one can tell you just easily, like unless something happens. And then now I have evidence and I can tell you, by the way, I think you're at risk here. You're being a little too influenced. It doesn't look like you understand. You need to educate yourself. You need to understand what's happening to you. Are you accepting this consciously? You're aware, or you're not even aware that this is happening to you. You're just slipping slowly, right? Like maybe there are things that can make me say that to you from the outside. But otherwise, this is all internal. All we can do is that's why I call it immunity. All I can do is inject you with knowledge, with arguments, with context, with history, with identity, and then throw you out in the world and hope that it's enough. This is enough immunity, and it's never enough. You always have to keep getting recharged. All of us, yani. And when we say I don't mean me. I would say you, I don't mean you. I mean in general. All we can do is that. Right? And if you follow the Quran, we have to do it to each other. Right? This is the tawasaw bil-haq wa tawasaw bil-sabr. This is, I have to do it to you, I have to immunize you and you have to immunize me. I have to remind you and you have to remind me. I have to preach to you and you have to preach to me. And that creates the community. But it's a tough question.
Beautiful answer. Like, it makes total sense, you know. Like,
Yeah.
You have to do it thoroughly, and also like externally, you have to know, but not too deep where you fall in.
And it's only valid, the answer is only valid if you are in a situation where you lack clarity. It's not like you have two options and one of them is clearly the truth and one of them is iffy. In that case, I would say go for the truth. If it's clear to you, why are you asking me? Go for the truth, period. This is only applicable when you say there is good and bad here and there is good and bad here. And the good and bad are mixed up enough, confusing enough that I can't make up my mind. That's when that answer works.
In general, though, with cultural hegemony, when we're talking about it, it's not just truth and falsehood. Because you could be in a capitalist society talking about communist thinking, right? So it has nothing to do with true or false. But
Of course.
when you're talking about communism in a capitalist society, you have a lot more that you have to do in terms of breaking down people's preconceived notion that before they label you a communist and everything you say doesn't matter anymore, right?
Correct.
But also helps, I guess, in that end that there is also another hegemonic force that's pushing that something like unionization would become popular in the States to combat.
Yes.
I guess something like that, where if you don't have another hegemonic force, it's a very different equation.
It's one way.
It's one way.
Yes.
Are we going to get into more detail about hegemonic cultural hegemony or not? And also neoliberalism, are you going to talk about that or no?
We're going to touch on it indirectly. We will touch a little bit on it, but not in any depth. Not at this part. Not as part of the community and the intellectual. You're going to have to tell me your level of interest. There's a few things waiting for us. So one of them, for instance, when we're going to talk about the types of knowledge. Earlier, much earlier in the series, there was a lot of interest in a few topics. One of the topics, for instance, was history and the different schools of or philosophies of history and so on and so forth. If there is interest when we're going to talk about how much importance Islam gives to learning history, we can spend a bit of time explaining that. Or we can talk about history for 15 minutes and move on to the next thing that Islam considers important to learn. Right? We can dedicate 15 lectures to explaining history because we're talking about history. So the same thing, like I'm giving you all the punchlines. So when we're going to get to the types of knowledge, one of the areas of knowledge that Islam insists on, inshallah for us, and I consider us to be the elites, is to understand the world in which we live. And so we're going to try to do a quick analysis of the world in which we live by giving a few categories of things to keep in mind. So one of them has to do with the neoliberal order of the world. So if there's interest, we can detail. If not, we mention very quickly and we move on. So later in this theme, in the theme of knowledge and reason, a little bit later, yes, we are going to have the opportunity, and it will be the right logical place to talk about it. The next one is going to be much later when we get in the series to the theme of the Islamic economic order and what it proposes. And there, I was hoping to keep it short. It will still be a full theme, but I was hoping to keep it short and just focus on the general principles that Islam considers to be, or today we would say are the general principles of Islamic economy. But of course we could open it up to more. Iqtisaduna is a tricky one. I don't know if I open it up or not yet. Because اقتصادنا is very technical. And the moment you get to that level of detail, you see that it's no longer what Islam says. It is the very technical solution of one genius thinker.
Yeah, and it's also very relevant to its time where those two thoughts were very
Exactly.
close to right now.
Yeah. It's still very relevant. I still think nothing of the sort has been attempted before or after. That's my read and assessment. With all of its, and there were shortcomings in the solution. Still, leaps and bounds beyond anything else that had been proposed, or to me has been proposed. Anyone who came after built on it. No one was starting from scratch. He started from scratch. And so, in any case, inshallah, we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get there.
One last question. How do you spell Rousseau? His last name is it?
Who?
John Rousseau.
Sartre. So Jean-Paul, so Jean is Jean, Gean dash Paul, Paul, and Sartre is Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre. And Rousseau is another thinker. He's called Romanticism, but after the Renaissance. So each one of these needs an explanation of what they mean, inshallah, in the future. But Rousseau is Roussseeau. Roussseeau. And so he's kind of like today that trend, especially in the Islamic world, they refer to it as like humanist thinking. It's all about the human beings and what that means. Yeah.
And has any one of these thinkers really made, apart from Rousseau that I know a little bit, he touched upon Islam, and he even said we can learn from the Islamic civilization to some extent. But has any one of them tried to dig into the Islamic civilization, in general, and in particular the teachings of Ahlul-Bayt alayhi salam?
Amazing question. I wish I knew the detailed answer. I can give you the high level answer. So are you talking specifically about the philosophe and Rousseau that time?
Yes.
Yeah. So
And around that time, even what's his name, the French philosopher who converted to Islam. In fact, not as famous as Rousseau and others, but he has quite a lot of work. Then, the one of his work is the challenge of modern times or something like that.
is it Guénon? René Guénon? Yeah. So Guénon is writing in the early 1900s. So this is the crisis of modernity. The crisis of the modern world, ahsantum. And he converted and he studied Islam and he became kind of a Sufi in that tradition. When we're talking about them, we're talking about 1600s, 1700s. So a good 200 years before. So there's three big names. The philosophes are three big names: Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot. Montesquieu is he's an expert in law. He's a philosopher who wrote very significant works, or a major significant work, L'Esprit des Lois. It's kind of like the philosophy of law, even though a lot of things that he says were already said by Ibn Khaldun and others. But generally speaking, so he studied Islamic law in general to speak about it. They used to call it Mohammedans, the law of Muslims. They refer to Muslims as Mohammedans. And so did he know about Islam? Yes. and I mention him because I would say he's probably the one who knows in the most technical way about Islam, because he studied a little bit and he talks a little bit about it in his work, Islamic law. Voltaire had very broad general culture, very broad. So he certainly knew about Muslims, and they all interacted with Muslims because there were many Muslims living in their world through Andalusia and Spain, and the presence of Muslims in Europe at that time. They interacted with Muslims. Like Islam was not just an idea to them. They dealt with Muslims all the time. And so especially Voltaire and a little bit Diderot too, they could respect a Muslim purely on intellectual ground. And Voltaire is like, he's the one who said the famous words of, I will disagree with you until death, and I will give up my life defending your right to hold your views against mine. Right? So it's all about, like, it doesn't matter that I disagree with you. I will never agree with your thought, and I will defend to death your right to be in disagreement with me, because this is how it should be. You're allowed to think whatever you want, and I'm allowed to think whatever I want. So, of course, there's something very appealing and beautiful in that. To my knowledge, absolutely no mention or knowledge of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, of course. None, zero. And that would be the case for pretty much most of them. So the ones of them who are like the highest education, they studied from each other. It goes back to medieval times. In medieval times, they translated all of the major works from Islam. So all of the big Islamic thinkers, their works had been translated, like Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, and they had been translated into Latin, and they studied them. And many of them, those who had studied originally in the church, they also were able to read Arabic. And Arabic was considered the lingua franca for a very long time in the medieval times. So this was the official diplomatic language of the world. Just like until recently, it was French. And that's why you see in like all the households of the kings and queens of the world, they would educate their children in French, because this is the diplomatic language of the world, and this is how you write laws. This is how you communicate between kings and queens and monarchies. There was a time when it was Arabic. And so many of them spoke Arabic. And, before other languages, even before Latin. And so when Latin became the language, especially in Europe, or was the language but remained the language and took more and more space, there were still enough of them who could read Arabic. And then you can see the traces of a lot of the thinking in the writings of the philosophers. That came later. If you understand enough of what was said by, Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina and others, you are able to tell that these ideas that you find in Hume and in Descartes and in Kant, they actually trace back directly to there. And there are ideas that you can, like, it's very surprising. It's almost like they emerged at the same time, or the works of Al-Ghazali were very, very popular. Ibn Rushd, very popular. So their work spread far and wide. And they just don't attribute it. And that's the most frustrating part. They never attribute anything to outside of their own madhab, right? If the truth is not coming from within, they will never tell you that this was taken from or borrowed from. They respect them in the sense that they will go learn from them, but they will never tell anyone that I learned from them. And so there's a lot of digging required to trace it back. And so you can't tell, you can't tell and say, today they knew this or they were exposed to that. They will never tell you. The only time they openly said it is to disagree with it. That's the only time they will raise it. It's like they have a thought against the thought that they heard. Then they will tell you, they will ridicule it, and they will, distort it to present it as though it's something silly.
So
Yeah.
we had this, like, even earlier on, within the Islamic civilization, where Abu Hanifa was a student of Imam Jafar, and he went on to create his own madhab.
Yeah.
And not even make a single reference to what he learned from
The Imam.
Malik.
But also, even before the Renaissance, like even with the traditional era, like a huge part of that traditional era that existed in Europe, it came, like the Quran and everything, it came from Muslims. For example, like St. Thomas Aquinas was like the foundation for basically the Ghazali for Catholics. So basically even Protestants.
Yeah.
Because since we had the law faith, like it came from Muslims. So it's not just post-Renaissance, even before Renaissance.
Yeah, yeah. No, and when I say medieval, like I'm going really back, like I'm going to, yeah, I'm going, now we're kind of focusing on late 1600s and up, 1700s and afterwards. But no, I mean like, since about, let's say, that whole time between, let's say, year 1000 and about 1500. That whole time is like, this is medieval dark ages in the West, in Europe. And whenever you are educated, it means you're educated through Islamic science and Islamic scholarship and Islamic civilization. And, that's what makes you, high class. And then slowly they start building their own.
I mean, thinking about Islamic civilization, I mean, to be very frank, I have a lot of doubts about it, as a civilization.
Yeah.
Whether it can even qualify to be called a civilization for all the injustices that it.
Of course. If you focus on the injustice, I agree with you. But this is the thing, like the way I think to find the balance there, the truth is that in Islam, there is so much good, so it is so dominant compared to anything else in the world, that even if you take like 2% of it, like you distort everything and you keep 2 or 5% good from it, that's still enough, and it does not compare to anything else in the world. And I think that's like how we have to see what happened. We're not saying that it was good, but we're saying that there was still enough good. And the truth is, Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam did not fight all of it. Right? They let go of some things because, you know what? There is enough good in there that, inshallah, really, for those who want to find the truth, they will be able to find the truth. Right? And it will still create a situation where the truth can be preserved, can be hidden, can be protected. But I agree with you, of course. We have to be very clear in our criteria before we assess, was it truly a golden age? Was it truly civilized? So I'm using the word as it is used in history and sociology, not in a civilization like any other. Not to say like it means it's a good thing or a bad thing. But when you compare to the regressive barbarian state of Europe during that time, there's no question that Islam was a civilization to them. And they were savages. The way they lived and the way they ate and the way they were savages.
And talking about the golden age, I believe Muslims had a golden age, but the gold was like probably 98% something else.
Yes, of course. Golden by the standards of empire.
Yeah.
Golden by the standard that you can have successful military expeditions and you can go take over lands and you can take over riches and you constantly expand. The same criteria today, right? Like that would mean that you are a true superpower, that you truly can dominate, that you can truly impose your force directly and indirectly. That's the standard, right? And you create comfort, luxury, all of that for your people within. And you create fear and domination for outside so that no one dares to even attack you and so on and so forth.
But we need to, I think, redefine that as well, like as intellectuals.
Yes.
And not accept it as, gold is something pure, like it's something good, inherently, like, when it comes to the material world, right? It's so pure, it's so precious.
Yes.
Right? Well, if we are referring to an era as a golden era,
then
that means that it was pure, it was so good inherently, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't. So
100% there was
injustices.
Yeah.
And because the way prosperity is defined, like prosperity comes based on injustice, that's backwardness. That's anti-civilization. And if we are talking about real prosperity, that's based on justice. That should be based on justice, right?
Yes.
And that can ensure sustainability of in a true civilization.
Yeah.
Which I think we all are hoping that with the coming of Imam,
Of course.
Mahdi alayhi salam,
Jalla
that we'll see that true civilization.
Yeah. Yeah. No, of course. There is no doubt about that. What they call the golden age of Islam is really the time of Harun al-Abbasi, right? And they call him Harun al-Rashid. And you are the one who causes the death of the imams of your time, 3 imams, and all the oppression and all the injustice and all just the manner in which he lived and all of that. I mean, but it depends what you consider to be the standard. So no, we completely agree. It's just we're reusing and recycling the same terminology that today, if you read anywhere, they will say this is the golden age of Islam. This is how they refer to it, that whole period of the Abbasids.
Popular among,
No, of course.
And I tell them that the golden age was only had a gold, kind of plate underneath.
Yes, gold plated with filth under.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely
I'm
right.
not very popular, some of them hate me, which is fine, that comes with the role you play as an intellectual.
Let's wrap it up here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.